Hello Patreon people, this is another Patreon video in which I am going through the Gospel of Mark with you. I'm walking you through Mark to kind of show you how it all fits together. Because most people I know of in my life, when it comes to things in the Gospels or the Bible in general, they think they know it. Like, oh yeah, I know about Jesus, I know about David and Goliath or David and Bathsheba. But they don't really know it. They know that the short Sunday school version or the cartoon version of something, and thus they don't really know the full narrative. So in this case, with the Gospel of Mark, for example, most people don't really know the Gospel of Mark, what he's trying to put forth and how he's trying to put it forth. And that's what I've been doing over the last few weeks. I'm kind of showing you the kinds of things that I am working on for my Old and New Testament books, in this case, sections on the Gospels. And so that's what we've been doing for the last few weeks. Last week I took you through the section of Gospel of Mark that began with the Beelzebub controversy and went all the way through Jesus' healing of the demoniac. And it's always good to remind yourself the overall narrative flow of a particular gospel. So for example, in Mark, at the very beginning, it starts off with the baptism of Jesus, his temptation in the desert, and then he goes and starts proclaiming the kingdom of God is near. And then all through chapter 3, it's kind of various accounts of his early ministry in Galilee, where he's healing people, he's casting demons out. But in that one point, when he claims to forgive the sins of a paralytic, that's when some of the Jewish religious leaders start not liking him as much, and there's a conflict brewing. All that is kind of in chapters 1 through 3. And then last week what we looked at is where that conflict really came to a boil in the Beelzebub controversy, where basically, when it gets right down to it, what happened here? There we go. The Pharisees come right out and say that you're casting out demons because you work for Beelzebub. And Jesus says, no, I don't. I'm working for the kingdom of God. And right there, it sets up this theme that's going to run through a big chunk of Mark. Basically, which kingdom is Jesus working for? Is he working for the kingdom of Satan or working for the kingdom of God, basically? And he says in the Beelzebub controversy, I'm not working for Satan. That'd be stupid if I was, because why would I cast out demons? Instead, I'm working for the kingdom of God. And then right after that, in chapter 4, he tells a whole bunch of parables about what the kingdom of God is like. And then, at the end of chapter 4, he gets on a boat, and he's at sea, and there's a storm at sea, and it's very much like a Jonah theme. And the purpose of that is Mark is trying to get us to see that Jesus is like Jonah in some way, but greater than Jonah. Jonah was sent to the Gentiles. Jonah didn't want to. He was a rebellious prophet. Jesus, his gospel, is eventually going to go to the Gentiles, but he is the faithful Messiah, faithful prophet. Therefore, he is, in fact, doing things that only God himself can do. And then after that scene with the Jonah illusion on the water, we find him in chapter 5 in the region of the Gerasenes where he heals a demoniac. And that is an area in Gentile territory. So right there, when you look at that first little strand from the Beelzebub controversy to the demoniac, there's a question of kingdoms and Jesus teaching what the kingdom of God is like, but then acting out something about the kingdom of God, going to Gentiles and casting out demons there as well. Now this next section of Mark that we're going to go through today is basically takes us from 521, hopefully through the end of chapter 6. That's what I'm going to try to cover today fairly quickly. And when you look at what is going on in this section from 521 to 656, it is all primarily about Jesus taking the kingdom of God, to his fellow Jews. After the demoniac of the Gerasenes, they get back in the boat and they cross the sea, so they're now back in Jewish territory. And the first scene takes place in 521 to 43. And it is one of those chiastic things. I think I mentioned it earlier, I called it a theological cheeseburger. This is like a theological burger. It's just really basic. Top bun, there's a scene. The meat is in the middle, and the bottom bun is another scene that parallels the first scene. Okay? And this is what it is, really simple. You can read it yourself. he is asked to, let's see, Jairus, he was a synagogue leader, he comes to Jesus and asks Jesus to come and heal his daughter. Okay? And Jesus agrees. That's the top bun. On the way there is like the meat of this chiastic structure. On the way there, we are told about a woman with a blood flow. Not to be gross, but basically she has a continual menstrual flow. And in Jewish culture, you were ceremonially unclean during your period. So for her, her problem is because it was constant. She was never ceremonial clean, so she was always cut off from the feasts and the temple worship. She was cut off from being truly part of the people of God. Long story short, as Jesus is going to Jairus' house, this woman comes up behind him. She touches his cloak, and she feels in herself that she has been healed. Jesus turns around and says, "Who touched me?" And his disciples say, "You're in a crowd. Everybody's touching you." And Jesus, no, who touched me? I know something happened. She comes forward, tells him what her situation was and what had happened. And Jesus tells her, and this is really important, he says, "Daughter, some translations say your faith has healed you." It literally, in Greek, it literally means your faith has saved you, which is really important. Because, if you grow up in, church, evangelical church, you think of salvation as my soul goes to heaven. So it's kind of weird for him to say that to her when all of this has happened to that she's, she's been healed. But from the Jewish perspective, she has been saved, meaning being physically healed has now made her part of the people of God again. She can be reconciled within the people of God and truly be part of that people. And so Jesus tells her, "Daughter, your faith has saved you." And we were told that she had had this condition for 12 years. Now those three things are really important. She's had the condition for 12 years. Jesus addresses her as daughter, and your faith has saved you. After that, he goes to Jairus' daughter's house. Daughter, get it? And we find out that she's dead. And everybody's in mourning, and he tells them, no, she's just asleep. And then when they start making fun of him, he throws them all out, and he goes in with his Peter, James, and John, and Jairus and his wife. And he tells Jairus, just have faith. Your daughter will be saved. And he goes in and he raises the daughter, and we're told that the dead girl was 12 years old. So right there, the story with Jairus' daughter and the woman with the blood flow, there's a literary connection that we're to see. Both involve the 12 years, both involves your faith saving you, meaning being brought back into the community of the people of God, and both are addressed as daughter. Now, what's the point of that burger? The point is, again, to give context for Jesus' healings and his raising people from the dead. What he's doing with his healings is he is bringing these people who were formerly outside of the communion of the people of Israel, and he's bringing them back in to be part of God's people. And so this is kind of a hint of what he is doing among the Jews, bringing the kingdom of God to the Jews. His healings take on that theological connotation. After that, in chapter 6, we're told he goes to Nazareth, and we're told he wasn't really, how can we put it, accepted. And this is where he says a prophet is never welcomed in his hometown. So that tells you something. Even though he's having some success among the Jews, his fellow Jews, he isn't among others, like in Nazareth. So like you'll see that throughout the Gospels emphasize this at various times. When he brings the kingdom of God to the Jews, there is division among the Jews. Some accept him, some don't. After he gets rejected at Nazareth in 6:7-13, this is where he sends his 12 disciples out to preach to the towns and cities of Galilee and to spread the kingdom of God there. So this is what we're seeing, the dynamic we're seeing in this section. When Jesus brings the kingdom to his fellow Jews, to the Jews, accepted by some, not accepted by others. Now, when he sends the 12 out, this is where we get two really interesting scenes, and you have to see them together. It involves, and most people know the stories in general. In chapter 6, 14 to 29 is the story of John the Baptist being beheaded by Herod. And then in chapter 6, 30 to 46 is the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000. Now most people who've grown up in Sunday school, they know these stories. Oh yeah, John the Baptist, he was killed and his head brought in on a platter. Okay, what does that mean? I don't know, I just know that story. And then Jesus feeding the 5,000, well, bread and fish, yay Jesus. But that's the extent of we know it. When you look at the stories together, in comparison, it's really important to see. First off, in 6:14 to 29, the picture is of, it reveals what kind of king Herod is. And we're told that Herod is throwing a big party. His daughter-in-law, stepdaughter? I can't. The daughter of his new wife. Stepdaughter. I can't remember that. She dances before him and his fellow celebrants, and they're so impressed that he promises her, I'm going to give you anything you ask, up to half of my kingdom. And then we're told that she consults with her mom, and she says, I want the head of John the Baptist brought in on a platter. And we're told that Herod had imprisoned John because John had spoken against his marriage to his brother's former wife. And that Herod didn't want to kill John because he did kind of suspect he was a prophet. But this request at this party kind of forces his hand, and he capitulates, and he brings John's head in on a platter. That's a real gruesome thing. Now, to be clear, the image of the head being brought in on a platter, it's almost like it's being brought in as a cuisine. And Herod and his, and the people there, they don't eat the head. But the image is that of the king of Israel killing a prophet of God and bringing that in on a platter. And one of the things throughout the Old Testament and New Testament is the king of Israel was always known and referred to as the shepherd of Israel, because David was the king, he was an original shepherd. So the king of Israel was often known as the shepherd of his people. And so what you need to realize in the scene with Herod and John the Baptist is the picture is that Herod is a bad shepherd. He is feasting on his flock instead of caring for it and protecting it. When you realize that, you understand the significance of the very next scene in 6:30 to 46, where Jesus feeds the 5,000. Right after the John the Baptist Herod scene, we're told that Jesus is out in the wilderness with his fellow Jews, 5,000 Jews, 5,000 men, including women and children. Long story short, they are getting hungry, and his disciples say, hey, go send them away so they get something to eat. He says, no, you feed them. And they say, we don't have enough food. We don't have enough food. It turns out that the little boy has 2 fish and 5 loaves of bread. Or is it 2 loaves of bread and 5 fish? Whatever it is. Jesus takes it, blesses it, and he feeds all the 5,000. Now, in this situation, it's very significant. We're told that Jesus looked upon these people, and he saw that they were like sheep without a shepherd. And then he, therefore, gets them to sit down on the grass, and he feeds them, much like a flock in a pasture. And so the thing you have to realize with this story is Jesus is presented in contrast with Herod. Herod is the bad shepherd who feeds on his flock and who fails to protect it, and Jesus is the good shepherd who feeds his flock. And that's the significance of what Mark is trying to get at in this dual episode. It's not just saying, hey, look at this cool miracle Jesus did. It's the significance of it, is that Jesus is being portrayed as the good shepherd, not like Herod. Now, immediately after he does that, all the stuff that I've just talked about takes place in Jewish territory. Immediately after that, we have another scene at sea, just like the Jonah scene up there. And if you look at the PDF file that I give you, you'll be able to see it. We are told that after the feeding of the 5,000, that the disciples get in the boat, and Jesus says, I'll meet up with you. I'm going to stay here on this mountain and pray. And then in the middle of the night, there's a storm at sea again. And the disciples see Jesus walking on the water to them. Now again, if you're like me growing up in church, going to Sunday school, it's kind of depicted like, oh, wow, look at this cool thing Jesus does. He really is God. And we kind of leave it at that. Well, there's more to it than that. And the interesting thing in Mark is that when the disciples see Jesus walking on the water, Mark tells us that Jesus intended to pass them by. And then they got freaked out, and he gets in the boat with them, and they get on the other side. What the heck does that mean? He intended to pass them by. Was it like he was just like, hey, I'm going to outrun the boat? What a good trick. No. You have to understand what the significance of that phrase is, to pass by. That phrase is basically used twice in the Old Testament. One is when Moses is on Mount Sinai, interceding for the people of Israel who sinned with the golden calf. And on Mount Sinai, he asks to see God's glory. And God passes by Moses, and Moses gets a glimpse of God's glory. That's what to pass by means. To pass by means to reveal one's glory. The second instance of passing by happens when Elijah, after his victory with the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, Jezebel tells Elijah, I'm going to get you. Elijah is afraid. He runs away. He goes to Mount Sinai. And on Mount Sinai, he interacts with God, and at one point, God passes by Elijah, and Elijah gets a glimpse of his glory. And so what you need to see here, in this Jesus walking on the water scene, when he intends to pass them by, what is being said is that this is when he was intending to reveal his glory to his disciples, to really reveal to them who he really is. Because if you remember at the previous water scene when he commanded the wind and the sea, at that point the disciples were like, who is this guy? They still didn't get it. So here, basically, Jesus is intending to reveal his glory, but because they freak out, he doesn't yet. That comes later. Okay? Then after he walks on the water, that scene, at the very end of chapter 6, he goes to Gennesaret, which is another area in Gentile territory, and he does further healings. So what you want to see with this section is it's really primarily about him offering the kingdom of God to his fellow Jews and getting a mixed response, and him being contrasted with Herod. He's the true king of Israel. He's the true good shepherd, not like Herod. And the intending to pass by thing is paralleled with the Jonah story, the Jonah allusion earlier on. He's still trying to teach his disciples about the nature of the kingdom of God, and this whole bit has been the section where he takes it to his fellow Jews. Now next week, we're going to go through chapter 7 all the way through 8:13, and this section, if you look on the PDF file, is primarily focused on Jesus then taking the gospel to Gentile territory. And this is kind of builds into what the kingdom of God is all about. It's going to go to Jews, like we just saw, but it's also, with the Jonah theme, it's going to make its way to Gentiles as well. And part of what the kingdom of God is about in Mark is that very thing. The kingdom of God is going to go even to Gentiles as well. All right, so that's a little bit, and we will pick it up there next week. If you've noticed, my voice is a little gravelly. I've been sinusy and congested the last couple days, so it's been kind of tough, but I'm getting better. So enjoy this, and look for the next one next week.